Bill Mueller is Director Emeritus of the Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory in Ozaukee, Ozaukee County in Wisconsin. Bill has held various roles in avian ecology and conservation, including working on migratory sea ducks, the development of the Modus wildlife tracking system in Wisconsin, aerial insectivores in the Midwest, and stopover ecology of migratory birds in Wisconsin's largest urban area. Between 2010 and 2015, Bill's group conducted offshore and nearshore waterfowl surveys in Lake Michigan. His group flew parallel transects between the shoreline and 15 kilometers from the shore and rectangular survey blocks from Door County, Wisconsin to the Illinois-Wisconsin state line. Bill will talk to us more about how the project was implemented and the findings it generated. So without further ado, Bill, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Well, hello, everyone. Let's get started. One thing I have to tell you, maybe a little source of confusion. You'll see it listed there in the bottom line, Lake Michigan Bird Observatory. Well, when I was introduced as Director Emeritus of the Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory. That's what we used to be, right? So just this winter, there's our old logo on the left, and you'll often see us abbreviated to be WGLBBO. Some wags have called us WGLBBO. I never really cared for that too much. And as of the beginning of this year, we've changed our name. We have a new logo. We are now the Lake Michigan Bird Observatory. It's simplified somewhat. The observatory is no longer doing any active bat-related work, so we dropped that from our name. So when you see WGLBBO, you'll know that we're still talking about the same organization. So we've conducted offshore and nearshore surveys starting out in 2010. We got funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to do that. We worked by ourselves for a couple of years. Then we partnered with the USGS and with multiple other organizations across the lower Great Lakes. So not Lake Superior and not Lake Ontario, right? But the three central Great Lakes, and did surveys. And I'll show you some maps. So a large feature of this presentation is going to be multiple maps. So a separate project actually monitored not only these waterfowl and waterbirds near shore, but all bird species monitored were at Harrington Beach State Park in Ozaukee County, which is about, I want to say it's 70 miles north of us today. So what do we really know about waterfowl and waterbird concentrations, their movements, and their timing in the deeper offshore waters of the Great Lakes? So many of you have undoubtedly birded from the Lake Michigan shoreline somewhere. Maybe you set up a spotting scope and you could, with a lot of practice, you could probably identify birds 1,000 meters offshore, right? So we really wanted to know what's happening much further offshore, so out of sight of land. So one of our most familiar species, long-tailed duck, used to be called the old squaw many years ago. Newer birders hear me mention that name. It's a lot of people said that was culturally irresponsible to use that name. So that was one of the names that got changed in the 80s to long-tailed duck. When we changed taxonomy of birds, the English taxonomy, we've often made an attempt to make our taxonomy match up with people in the old world, in Europe and Asia, right? And so long-tailed duck is one of those species that circumpolarly distributed. It's all the way around the world, so you can easily find the species in the US, the old USSR, modern day Russia, Kamchatka, all the way to the far eastern part of Asia. So you could find long-tailed ducks in winter in Japan, for example. You could find them on the Black Sea. You can find them in many places in North America, as long as you've got a big body of water. So it's very unusual for long-tailed ducks to show up at some small isolated inland lake. They winter on the Great Lakes, especially in the southern part of the Great Lakes. And that's something that's mediated to some degree by the amount of ice cover in the Great Lakes. And that's something I'm going to talk to you quite a bit more about, because that's one of the things that we found really influences where those species are distributed. So back in 2009, I caused there to be the formation of this Great Lakes Offshore Research Advisory Group. You can see this alphabet soup in my lower paragraph there of all of the agencies that were representative. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Department of Natural Resources of several states, UW-Milwaukee, the U.S. Geological Survey, Michigan Natural Features Inventory, both Central and Eastern Michigan University, the Corps of Engineers, the Nature Conservancy, the EPA, Michigan Technological University, our state birding organization, WSO, and a number of other organizations. So we really wanted to address these questions of where these birds are found, because we wanted to prepare for the eventuality of possible offshore wind development. Now, if you've been following this, you've seen that we haven't really developed very much of the Great Lakes for wind power. And there's been a lot of pushback on that. For example, in 2010, they brought the curtain down on any additional wind power development in the state of Wisconsin. And that's continued on to the present day. So if you cast around and ask birders across the United States what they think of wind power, you'll find the whole gamut of opinions, right? You'll find some people who are very opposed to it. You'll find some people on the other end of the spectrum who are in favor of it, because believing that we have to prepare for climate change. But at the point at which we developed this project, we reasoned that eventually there would be wind power development in the Great Lakes. And we wanted to be able to have a seat at the table through our partnership with all of these agencies, right? So, for example, if a wind power developer wanted to develop somewhere in the Great Lakes, they have to be permitted by all of these agencies, depending on which state boundary they're closest to, how far offshore in the lake. So Corps of Engineers would be one organization that would really get involved in permitting them. And we reasoned that if we had this data to share with these agencies, we would be able to have a seat at the table planning any eventual wind power development. Now, there's other reasons to gather the data too. So just for the general sake of general scientific knowledge, we wanted to know more about what birds were doing in offshore waters of the lake. And the Great Lakes Commission eventually got involved in this, and we had multiple partners working on the other lakes as well as Lake Michigan. So we reasoned again that this was inevitable. Now, I still think it's inevitable. I still think it's going to come. Back in the 2000s, when someone would ask me, well, you know, you don't really like the idea of building turbines that are just offshore, right? for a lot of reasons. And at that point in time, there were only a few entities that were building really deep water wind, right? So if you looked at like Europe now, you would see that the bulk of the offshore wind there is built on the continental shelf. So it's water that isn't really that tremendously deep, and they can actually place a footing on the ocean bottom there, right? But then again, in the early 2000s, there were some experimental turbine designs that have now come into their own. 15 years have passed. And if you've been following this information, you'll see that we're actually building immense floating wind turbines. They're like a gigantic fishing bobber. They're tethered by a cable, so that the power generated by the turbine can go to a distribution point, right? But they actually move. And it doesn't matter how windy it gets, how wave tossed it gets, those immense floating turbines, the advantage of them, they can be much further offshore. One of the things that people in the Great Lakes have really hated in many cases about the development of wind affects what's called the view shed. People didn't like the idea of seeing a turbine out on the Great Lakes. So if you put the turbine way out in the Great Lakes or way offshore in the ocean, the view shed issue is gone, right? Because you won't see it. It'll be out of sight of land. In addition to which, one of the things we know is wind out there is much more reliable than it is on land. So the wind is blowing 24 hours a day. It's blowing at a much more reliable speed. So that's one of the reasons we did what we did. So to prepare for this, we started doing offshore surveys in the fall of 2010. We went through 2013, and we started surveys again with this large partnership of organizations in 2013 for another year and a half. So you can see the cross-hatching there. That's where my partners worked, in addition to the western shore of Lake Michigan, where my group worked. As the person who introduced me mentioned, we did surveys from Door County to the Illinois border. You can see the southern part of the lake there was covered by the U.S. Geological Survey, and as well as the eastern shoreline of Lake Michigan. Then some other partners worked in Lake Huron and in Lake St. Clair and the eastern part of Lake Erie. And yet another set of partners worked on the far eastern end of Lake Erie. So during that period of time, from the beginning to the end, we collected over 1.8 million observations of all kinds of offshore bird life, right? So the Great Lakes Commission got involved, broke up the project into a phase 1, 2, and 3. And we actually started asking additional questions, for example, about the ice coverage. I don't know if many of you remember this, but I'll show a picture of this a little later in my presentation. Occasionally over our history here in the Midwest, Lake Michigan has completely frozen over. Well, in the early part of 2014, about 90% of Lake Michigan's cover was ice, right? And diving waterfowl were dying at a huge rate because they actually couldn't find any open water to dive in, right? And this is something that you recognize fairly early about migratory birds. If birds wait too long into the winter season to undertake migration, they're not in physiological condition to conduct a migration. So example, let's say there's some goldeneyes and they're in this quickly narrowing lead of open water and the water's freezing. they're not in physiological shape to undertake a migration from Lake Michigan, let's say, to the Gulf of Mexico. They wouldn't be able to do it, right? And so they just kept trying to stay there. And I had a colleague who lived in Shorewood, Wisconsin, a suburb of Milwaukee, and he went outside one cold winter day and there was a red-breasted merganser walking down his sidewalk. That bird just ran out of steam, crash landed on the street, and had to be taken to a rehabber. So we lost a lot of birds in the spring of 2014 when that big freeze occurred. So in an effort to answer these questions, the project team set out to achieve the following 5 objectives. We wanted to build a community of Great Lakes avian researchers under the Midwest Coordinated Bird Monitoring Partnership. That's an entity that no longer exists. It's been renamed and it's something else now. We wanted to form some data sharing agreements where that would be appropriate. We wanted to identify the information gaps and priorities for learning more. We wanted to be able to collaborate on future projects, and we wanted to build upon our collective knowledge of birds' use of the Great Lakes. Then we wanted to be able to inform Great Lakes conservation and management decisions and influence decision makers in those regards. We ended up putting all of this data in a new entity called the Midwest Avian Data Center, which is part of the Avian Knowledge Network, which is a nationwide kind of collective of organizations that gather and interpret data. So we would be able to manage, share, analyze, and distribute the results from all that survey data. We wanted to then develop some predictive models of waterbird distributions and densities, and we wanted to incorporate all that data and the project results into some reports. And you're seeing part of one of those reports tonight. So you're probably familiar with these species. You know, they're not only Great Lakes species, although the Great Lakes are extremely important for them during migration, not so much during the breeding season, certainly, but again in winter. Red-breasted merganser in the lower right-hand corner there, tundra swans in the lower left, common merganser in the upper left, and common golden eyes in the upper right. So here's, if you were to go to the Midwest Avian Data Center and you go to the mapping page, you see the Great Lakes displayed there. And if I were to zoom in on that, you would see those 1.8 million data points around Lake Michigan, in Lower Lake Huron, in Lake St. Clair, in the west end of Lake Erie, and again in the east end of Lake Erie. So you'd see all of those data points because we're zoomed out sufficiently here. It looks just like a number of small circles, right? But if we really zoomed in, you'd see a tremendous amount of data. Now, if you look in the center, that column where those hyperlinks are, right? Those are all different sorts of bird monitoring efforts for different reasons, not just aquatic birds, right? But land birds also. So, but you'll see that the box is checked under Great Lakes avian transects, and that's the collective term for all of that data. So again, I've zoomed in a little bit here, and you can see a closer view of where all of that data is now. So our study area, as we mentioned several times already, was from northern Door County to the Wisconsin-Illinois border. In the first year and a half of our study, we actually continued on to the southern end of the lake. We didn't gather very much data there, and I'll explain why that is. So I want you to think about what this is like. Let's say it's December of 2011, right? And you're planning surveys. So you have to have a number of things kind of line up correctly. You've got to be able to have the availability of the plane and the pilot. Can't do it without them, right? Then you've got to be able to have 2 observers, because that was the protocol we used. We used a 4-seat, 2-engine aircraft. One, there's a pilot in the upper, the forward left-hand seat, an observer to his right, and an observer in the left-hand seat of the back seat, right? So those 2 observers looked out their window adjacent to them and counted from below the plane out a certain distance. And we didn't say to each other, like the person in the right-hand seat in the front did not say, I see X golden eyes over here, because we're actually trying to keep these data completely separate. So that person in the back seat on the left-hand side only counted birds that were to port side of the aircraft, right? And the person in the right-hand side counted only birds to the starboard side. And we didn't mix them up, right? When we saw a group of birds, could be as few as a single bird, a little tiny flock, even to very, very large rafts of birds, we would call out Mark, and the pilot would hit the onboard GPS. So in our data sheet, we would have, in accordance with that GPS point, a number and identification of the birds that we saw, and then the time, right? So you can see these sheets and sheets and sheets of data. And when we got to the end of the 5-year period of doing this, we actually used less paper sheets. We did it with an electronic recorder, a voice recorder, right? Because it was just a neater way to keep track of the data. So we surveyed everywhere from 1 mile offshore, 1.66 kilometers, to 16.1 kilometers to 10 miles offshore, right? Now, you would think, and you would be right, that the further you go offshore, the fewer and fewer and fewer birds you would see. Even in autumn, right? Even in the early spring, there's really not a lot of birds in really deep water for a variety of really good reasons, right? So you're thinking, especially in terms of these diving ducks. I don't know if you know much about long-tailed ducks, but they're really a fascinating species. The record holder for deep dives of any bird, long-tails regularly dive to 70 meters, right? They dive all the way to the bottom. They are benthic feeders, so they feed on tiny organisms that are at the bottom of the lake, but they generally don't feed in water that is more than like 100 meters deep, right? So again, if you look at and I'm going to show you some maps that show you the bathymetry, the varying depths of the lake offshore. This zone between shoreline and 10 miles offshore is where the bulk of these birds would be. And when we would do a transect 10 miles offshore, we would see longtails out there, right? And you'd wonder to yourself, well, what the heck are they doing out there? A lot of times they're just resting. They're just a big mass of 5,000 longtails in a big flock all together. They're not diving because the water's too deep there. So they're just resting there. They like to go where they're going to be left alone. And that's where they head when they want to take a break. So observations, again, were made from mid-October through early May, utilizing a twin-engine Wisconsin DNR aircraft flown out of Whitman Field at Oshkosh, Wisconsin. 2 observers made observations on each flight. We searched transects using parallel bands of known width. Here's the kind of a plane. It's a very unusual old Cessna. This plane was actually built in 1976, still being used by the DNR every single day. Several 100,000 miles on it. Just an amazing plane. One of the cool things about it is it's this high wing design. So when you're looking out the windows on either this port or the starboard side, you're not looking at the wing because the wing is above you. So the wing was not an obstacle to you viewing the water. So it just turned out to be a really excellent aircraft for doing this kind of work. Surveys were conducted along these transects oriented north and south and spaced 3.22 kilometers, in other words, 2 miles apart. This spacing helped avoid double counting of individuals and allowed adequate coverage. So when you see the maps, you're going to see a picture of all of these transects and how they're aligned in relation to lakeshore. The aircraft flew at about 95 miles an hour, 150 kilometers an hour, ground speed, following the map transects in alternating directions. So we fly the north direction first, and we'd go over 2 miles and fly the south direction. And we'd often do 2 survey blocks. These survey blocks 9 miles in width and approximately 40 miles long. We'd often do 2 survey blocks end to end on the same day to save fuel. So when we originally planned this survey, we really had a lot of excellent help from those pilots, because the first thing we thought of was doing transects east to west. And I remember meeting with the pilots and they said, well, Bill, when you come to the landward end of your transect and you turn the plane, you're not going to be above the water, right? And that's going to happen every time you do that. So you're actually wasting fuel then. So let's turn your transects north and south, right? And turned out to be a brilliant observation. So surveys flown 100 meters above the water. 100 meters above the water is actually pretty darn close to the water surface. And we have lots of funny anecdotes about traveling out there. For safety's sake, we had that twin engine aircraft. It's a really good thing we did, because one day one of the engines went out and we were miles out over the lake. We still had an engine though, so that brought us into land. And the world of using small aircraft, you know, you land at one of these tiny rural airports, you get out of the plane and you push the plane over to the gas pump. So it's a wholly different kind of experience than most flying that most people are used to doing, right? And we always had a safety in service before we took off. And the pilot would locate the big plastic box on the back seat. I often had the left seat on the back seat, and the life raft box sat on the seat next to me, right? And we wanted all 3 of us to know exactly where it was, how to get it open, how to put your life jacket on. And then we'd all be listening intently to this, even though we had heard it many times before. And then he would pause for a few seconds and he'd say, but we're not going in the water. And we'd all nod our heads real enthusiastically, because in November, you don't want to go in Lake Michigan. So the time of each bird sighting and the geographic location of it were marked by the use of that GPS device on board in the aircraft. No observations were made in extremely rough water. So we generally did not fly on days when the wind speed was more than 15 knots, because it causes there to be a lot of whitecaps, which causes some visual confusion when you're flying over the water. You don't want to mistake a whitecap for a bird. besides just for safety reasons, we generally tried not to be out over the lake when it was, especially not more than 20 knots. All birds were recorded to the best level of identification possible, although in some cases, when you're 300 feet above a flock of mergansers, sometimes the best you could do was say merganser species, right? Especially because female mergansers, both common and red-breasted mergansers, look very much alike from a distance, right? But that's a whole lot better than saying a bird, right? We had merganser species, right? And we did this with gulls too. We had a lot of gull species in our data, right? Because when you're a considerable distance away from herring gulls and ring-billed gulls, it's very difficult. In addition to which we were moving, right? We were going 95 miles an hour. So made it all somewhat challenging. Our sampling units were either single birds, groups of birds. And when I say groups, we had rafts of long-tailed ducks on some occasions that numbered 8,000 birds. And so when we'd see an immense raft like that, we'd sometimes have to go around it several times to get an adequate estimate of the size of the flock. With experience, you can learn how to count several hundred birds relatively quickly. If you've done offshore Christmas bird counts, for example, you learn how to count flocks, right? And it's something that can be taught. But counting a flock much larger than that, especially from an aircraft, is just something that you get with skill. So we redid aspects of our protocol in accord with those developed by our colleague Kevin Kenow of USGS. Kevin is one of the premier ornithological scientists of the Great Lakes. He's just done a tremendous, he does work on common loons, for example. You can find Kevin's name on a lot of scientific papers about loons. So this is a kind of an image of what the plane did, right? First couple of years, we started at 2 miles offshore. Then after 2011, we added that additional transect 1 mile closer to the shore because we realized we were missing a certain number of birds. So you can see the kind of paperclip formation that we flew in, right? Now, again, think about the fact that there's 2 miles in between each transect line, right? So you get to the north end, you fly 2 miles to the east, and then you turn south. So we've developed a ton of geographic information system products from this project. All those thousands of data points, they're all GPS. So this is just an example. I'm going to show you a lot of different maps. We actually have hundreds of maps. I'm publishing a paper on these results later this year. And the hardest job I have is choosing which maps to publish, because no journal is going to publish 200 maps, right? Mm-hmm. They will balk if I give them 12. So I have to really choose which are representative of the whole in my 10 or 11 or 12 maps that I'm going to publish. And I want to publish them in color, because if we were to make these symbols that I'm going to show you in grayscale, they would in no way convey the same amount of information that a colorized version does. So here's fall of 2013, offshore from Door and Kewaunee County. The 5 most abundant species are represented there. So here's what I call a triptych style. This actually shows something different. Instead of raw numbers, this shows density. So the more highly colored symbols that you see show birds at their highest density. And you can see each one of these maps represents a month, right? And just think about this again, this is logical. If you're in the autumn and you're looking at these, in some cases, subarctic nesting or even Arctic nesting in the case of long-tailed ducks, coming down into the Great Lakes for the winter. They start to show up in late October, really begin to build numbers in December. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more later on. And then they stay in Lake Michigan for the winter, although some of them continue on to the Gulf of Mexico for the winter, or even to offshore in the Atlantic Ocean. So some component of them in a normal year will stay in Lake Michigan in the winter. And you can see on the February map, right? The map leftmost there, right? That's the typical kind of midwinter distribution of that bird. And then as we get into March, that's the reverse. Birds are starting to make their way back north again. So they're filtering northward in the lake, right? And they're starting to disappear from the areas at the southernmost portion of the lake. And you can see that in that rightmost map, that a lot of those birds are no longer present there because they've already, it's beginning of spring migration, they're on their way back to the Arctic. So here's point density for common goldeneye. You can see a tremendous collection of birds offshore of Manitowoc County, some offshore of Milwaukee County. Milwaukee Bay, for example, has been this traditional wintering site for diving waterfowl for, well, as long as there's been a bay there, right? And this goes back into pre-human times, right? So thousands of years ago, in the days when there were still glaciers on the landscape, right? There were birds beginning to migrate, and there were probably, in other words, what I'm saying to you is there were probably birds in these prominent natural harbors in winter back several thousands of years, right? Before human beings were keeping any records of them, at least. So again, I mentioned bathymetry. You can see the blue part of the lake is all different colors. And you can see on my legend, the lightest blue is where the water is shallowest. The darkest blue is where it's deepest. Here's a couple of species that we didn't find very many of. We would not find generally a lot of the three scoter species. Not a big surprise. Those species are with us every spring and fall. There are not huge numbers of them at any time, and especially white-winged scoters. Now that picture is changing due to climate change. We don't see as many white-winged scoters anymore. We're seeing more black scoters that linger into the winter. So the whole ecology of the lakes and the timing of everything is dramatically changing right under our feet. So here's the four most common species: bufflehead, common goldeneye, long-tailed duck, and red-breasted merganser, offshore from Manitowoc, Sheboygan, and northern Ozaukee County. And you can see the colors represent those four different species, right? So they're all arrayed, in some cases very near shore, but in some cases a mile or two offshore. So here's a little bit different color representation. And you can see that as you get all the way north to Door County, you get really, really large numbers of long-tailed ducks there. And they're often 3, 4, 5 miles offshore. In some cases, depending on the water depth, they might still be diving in fairly deep water. But once the water gets to be 300 feet deep, 100 meters deep, they don't dive all that far to the bottom. They can't. It's not physically possible for them to do so. So the interesting thing is that since this project ended, I have a great colleague who now works at the USGS who is finishing his PhD work, and he has actually learned that the whole picture with foraging of long-tailed ducks is much more complex than we ever realized. So they eat a tiny little organism that's about the size of a grain of rice, a little amphipod. It's in the genus Diphtheria. Diphtheria used to be extremely abundant in the Great Lakes. As the water quality has changed in the Great Lakes, Diphtheria has started to fall off. Some parts of Lake Michigan, the population of Diphtheria has crashed. So Diphtheria does this really interesting thing, lives on the bottom most of the time. It's a benthic organism. But then after dark, it undertakes this diurnal migration up towards the surface, right? Begins to float upward towards the surface. And longtails change their behavior. They still forage at night in the water column. They're following this Diphtheria as it's making this diurnal and nocturnal movement from the surface to the bottom of the lake. So they're much, much more complicated in their behavior than we ever recognized until fairly recently. So again, offshore from Dora and Kewaunee County, this is a kind of a map that actually shows you abundance. So this is what's called a graduated circle map. The larger the circle, the greater of numbers of birds at that point. So you can see the biggest circle shows flocks of birds numbering in the several thousands, right? And offshore from Kewaunee and Two Rivers, and then offshore from Sturgeon Bay, Door County, really, really immense numbers of long-tailed ducks. Now, just as an aside, perhaps some of you may know waterfowl hunters. So waterfowl hunters, you know, if you know any, like some of the folks that I know, they're as passionate about waterfowl hunting as most of the rest of us are about just observing birds, right? And long-tailed duck is actually like a trophy organism for them. So there are a number of guides that work out of these harbors that take specialized boats, which they anchor offshore, cover up with a tarp, and put huge blocks of decoys, 200, 400 decoys in fairly deep water. And they decoy in the long-tailed ducks and harvest them. And long-tailed duck is not a duck species that you would choose to be like choice eating, because it doesn't feed on the kind of things that make very palatable flesh. So a lot of the guys that hunt longtails, it's really like trophy hunt for them because it's a spectacularly gorgeous thing. They usually only do this once every so many years. They take the best specimen that they get and they have it mounted and put it on the wall. Now, you and I might look at this and look askance at this and say, well, you know, I'm not really too high on this whole concept, but it's extremely important to them. And I've presented this same information to, for example, the Wisconsin Waterfowl Hunters Association, because they're really interested in what we learn. So here's a little bit different view. Again, Sheboygan down to Port Washington and Ozaukee County. And these are kind of pooled observations of all of the species together. So those really large circles show the location of those really, really large rafts of birds. So the locations, as I already mentioned, they shift throughout each season, right? So you see the beginning of the collection of these birds in late autumn. Then you see some birds continuing through the winter. Some of the species probably completely leave the Great Lakes for the winter. They're not quite as hardy. They may go all the way to the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic coast. And then starting in March, they reappear. And then as we get into April, especially later part of April, all those birds are filtering out of the Great Lakes, going north into the subarctic and the Arctic. So really tremendous numbers of birds. And in many cases, these are birds that you cannot see from shore because they're too far offshore. So that map on the left really shows the collection of 2 years of data, right? There's thousands of data points in there. And that's like the array of the survey blocks, those rectangular survey blocks, parallel to the lakeshore, right? Off on the right, again, 4 most common species, and that is March of 2012. So you could see there were actually data points as far as 10 miles offshore. Most frequently observed species, long-tailed duck, red-breasted merganser, common goldeneye, greater scaup, Bonaparte's gull, and bufflehead. So the picture that is happening with the timing of migration of all of these species is being rather dramatically influenced by climate change. So I frequently encounter people who will say to me, I don't believe in all this stuff about climate change. You know, I always want to go, come on with me and I'll show you what happened, right? You'd actually have to spend quite a bit of time with me to be able to see it happening. But believe me, I've seen it happen. So greater scaup, for example, we used to see them in the autumn. They would appear in these Great Lakes offshore regions, usually 15 October. Now they're appearing sometimes not until the first week of December. Why is that? Because think of all the breeding lakes that contain greater scaup during the breeding season, June and July. Those lakes are not freezing up as early as they used to. So there's nothing driving those birds to go south. They don't really start to move south until their breeding lakes start to freeze up, right? And as the climate warms, that's getting later and later and later and later. So here's phase 1 and phase 2 of this Great Lakes Commission project. Fall of 2012, long-tailed ducks, 29,152. Percent of the total of all the birds we counted was fully 60%. Next in line, red-breasted merganser, then either of the scaup. Again, it's kind of hard to identify a greater and a lesser when you're in an aircraft. Some people have trouble identifying them when they're 20 feet away, right? They're confusing. Red-breasted merganser in the spring, long-tailed duck next, and common goldeneye next. And then as we go into phase 2, you see the numbers changed a bit, but it's still composed of basically the same species with the influx of really large numbers of Bonaparte's gulls. So that's one of the things that has changed. And I've been watching birds since the 1950s. Yes, I am that old. You know, I started when I was in first grade. And the picture of migration and the numbers of birds and the timing of migration has greatly changed, and the pace of change has accelerated since the 1990s. So we very clearly see that in the data. So here's some key observations related to all the data collected in both phases of this project. Concentrations of all species change continually throughout each season, month by month, related to temperature, both air temperature and water temperature, other weather factors, and ice conditions. Ice conditions turned out to be a bigger thing than we ever dreamed it would be. The timing of migratory movements is also key to current weather conditions. Waterfowl and waterbirds move north earlier in Lake Michigan following mild winters. Not a surprise, but probably not something that we would have imagined or predicted. So one of our challenges, really, again, let me get you to recall what I mentioned to you in the early part of the presentation when I was talking about the logistics of planning surveys, right? So we had to have 2 observers available, the plane, the pilot, the weather had to be decent enough. In other words, like not 40-mile-an-hour winds, not a blizzard, you know, not either unsafe conditions or conditions that would make it impossible for us to see what we needed to see. So finding and mapping waterfowl distribution during times of extensive ice cover really affected. So the left-hand picture was taken by my dear friend and colleague, Joel Trick, who used to work for the Fish and Wildlife Service, was a member of this project from day one until its end. And he took a picture showing those masses of floating ice, right? And sometimes that ice would be, again, I'm going to try to get you to imagine, let's say you're going to make a drink for yourself in an ice cube tray, a rectangular thing about that wide, that long, and you got some, your drink, whatever you're going to drink is floating around in there, and you got a whole bunch of ice cubes in there, right? And so those are not cubes, they're lenses of ice. Sometimes they're 2 meters, 3 meters long, 1.5 meters wide, and they're about that thick, sometimes a little thicker, and they kind of curl up at the edge. They're real peculiar looking. If you go up along Lake Michigan in the winter, you can often see those lenses of ice forming in the harbors, right? And so again, imagine you're there with 1,000 of your flock mates, and it's 1 o'clock in the morning, and it's about 5 degrees above 0 Fahrenheit, right? And there's no wind. And you're kind of moving around in the water. You're not asleep, you're awake for sure, right? Because it's kind of dangerous conditions. You run the risk of actually being frozen in place, right? So these birds are kind of moving around. They're trying to keep the water close to them from freezing. And then all of a sudden, the flock makes a decision, right? Now, how the flock makes a decision together, I've heard all kinds of different potential explanations for this. I'm not sure how much credence I put in any of them, but the flock seems to have a mind, right? All of a sudden, you know, you're a mile offshore and there's this big mass of floating ice east of you in the lake. The flock decides we've got to get the heck out of here. So they all take off from the water surface and they fly east. They fly over that mass of ice to open water where it's completely open again. Now they're in much deeper water, but at least they're safe from being frozen in place, right? So every day, depending on the wind, this big floating mass of ice, if the wind is easterly, that floating mass of ice comes inshore, comes very close to the shore. And whatever open water leads existed there, right, they tend to evaporate and force those ducks to go further offshore. When the opposite condition exists, when the wind is from the west, that big mass of ice pushes out into the lake further, and thus allowing those birds that are further offshore to fly over that mass of ice and come in and land closer to shore, where A, the water will be shallower, B, they will be able to access some food. So they're constantly moving in response to how these ice conditions are continually changing. So think about what actually drives that. Temperature, obviously, right? So when it gets really cold, and if it's not windy, it's fairly easy for that ice to form. It can be really cold and very windy, and ice generally will not form, even to really cold temperatures, right? But if the wind is happening, the wind is really determining where these birds are going to be on any given day. And it's also going to be determining whether we can count them. Because if there was enough ice, right? And in 2014, as you can see from the satellite photo of Lake Michigan, a tremendous area of the surface of Lake Michigan was covered with ice, right? So birds were dying because they starved to death, right? You can see the southeast corner of the lake there was some open water. So these masses of long-tailed ducks on any given winter, they may be greater in number on the Wisconsin side, or they may be greater in number on the Michigan side of the lake, depending on the movement and wind direction and extents of the ice that develops there. So, not surprising, if any of you are engineers in this room, if you think about, okay, how are they going to build wind turbines and deploy them in Lake Michigan? Because ice would prove to be a really significant engineering challenge to anything that you would build that would be anchored to the bottom, right? So lots of complexity built into all of these things here. So what did we do with all of the data, right? We put it in the Midwest Avian Data Center that I mentioned. We've also, with partners from all across the continent, as part of the Sea Duck Joint Venture, which is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service-led project, we worked with our partners there to develop what's called the Sea Duck Key Habitat Sites Atlas. So a little bit different than a breeding bird atlas. This actually shows where birds are in those sea duck species during the breeding season and during migration and in winter. So a tremendous amount of partners were involved in this work for the whole of North America. So all the 50 US states, all of the Canadian provinces, Mexico. You can see a map where all of the, so here's what the document looks like. You can download this document at the Sea Duck Joint Ventures website. It's 286 pages, full of information about where those birds are, depending on what season of the year you're interested in. So here's the second and third page of that document that shows you mapped the locations of all of these key sea duck habitat sites, right? And you can see good old Lake Michigan right down there in the lower right. I and some of my partners wrote the site accounts for this Sea Duck Atlas. We used data from our project to do that. So I wrote the key site account for what's called Key Site 67 from Sturgeon Bay to Manitowoc. You can easily look there. In autumn of 2013, a total of 52,704 sea ducks of all those species together were tallied in that area. When you take both spring and fall migration into consideration, this zone offshore from Manitowoc and Door counties, one species alone has 100,000 red-breasted mergansers pass through that zone every year, right? So it's tremendously rich in biological life and really important from a whole variety of different sources. So that's the boundaries of that key site that extend up into northern Door County and as far south as the Manitowoc County line, up to about 12 miles offshore. So here's some questions we're still addressing. I mentioned that I'm readying a paper for publication later this fall. We still want to understand more about this ice buildup question. That's never been adequately addressed, and I can't make a claim that we've adequately addressed it either. So we need more information, for example, satellite data to be able to portray the regular nature of ice buildup in the Great Lakes and how often it happens, whether it's changing due to climate change. The water depth, the bathymetry, is another question. So one of the things at the beginning of this project that I wanted to find out the location of all the offshore reefs, underwater reefs. Able to find it. At that time, those reefs were not mapped. Now that's all changed, right? Their Great Lakes researchers have done a magnificent job of gathering all that data, but I haven't put that together with my data yet. So that's something that we're still working on. So I mentioned that idea of those longtails being 10 miles offshore in very deep water. We know that they're not foraging out there. The water's too deep for them to get to the bottom. So sometimes they're just loafing out there because it's safe. They might go out there on a, what would still be to us an extremely frigid day, right? 8-mile-an-hour breeze, water temperature about 33. You wouldn't want to be in that water for very long. But to a long-tailed duck, it's just like we like us when we're in the bathtub. They're completely at home, right? They don't feel cold. They've got a lot of subcutaneous fat, real heavy layer of plumage, and they're adapted to those conditions perfectly. So temperature changes during migration affect large-scale movement and distribution in relation to the flock's positions along the lakeshore. We notice this change in autumn movements as that's trending later for a lot of these diving duck species. We reset the date. I'm going to tell you about our Nearshore project. Our Waterbird technician formerly watched from a shoreline position from the beginning of September to about the 20th of November, right? After a number of years of him doing that work and noticing the shift, we moved his beginning date to the 15th of September and his ending date to be the 5th of December. Now, we ran out of funding to do this work back in 2019. If we were to go back to do it again, we would again have to move these dates because this process hasn't ended, it's continuing. So separate from these aircraft surveys, but related to them, we did this thing called the Lake Watch, right? A lot of bird observatories do something like this from the western shoreline of Lake Michigan and Ozaukee County from 2012 through 2019. Our single station, we had one person manning it from March 1 to May 20 in the spring, from September 1, September 15 to the beginning of December in the autumn. Waterfowl and waterbirds were the focus, but Calvin Brennan, my adept technician, was really good at identifying everything. So we just, very near to the start of the project, we just told them, tally everything, right? Identify every individual that you see and tally, right? 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, starting at dawn. In each of those 14 seasons at that station, he tallied between 175,000 and 220,000 migrating birds of between 165 and 185 species. And Calvin was really good at it. I mean, I mentioned that I've been birding since the 50s, right? I've done a lot of birding. That's been like the singular focus of my life. And I used to stand with Calvin and set up my telescope and stand next to him in his telescope. And he was calling out birds that were 1,200 meters offshore. I could see a bird, right? But it wasn't, and he would tell me what it was. And it turned out, in most cases, he was right. He was really good at it. So here's temporal distribution of long-tailed ducks across the weeks of a spring season, right? Really high numbers in March. And then as you get into the later part of March, trails off immediately down to nearly zero by early May. Here's the 10 most abundant species in, it says fall or spring, but I can't read it, 2017. The waterfowl species are highlighted. 30,000 or 41,000 red-breasted mergansers. That's just one season. 30,000 plus Bonaparte's gulls. 17,000 plus herring gulls. 14,000 plus ringbills. A lot of common terns. And again, if you would see this over the like a century of elapsed time, probably a century ago, common tern would be the first on that list. It was a super abundant bird, and its population has almost crashed in comparison to where it once was. Greater scaup over 11,000, double-crested cormorant 11,000. I remember in the 60s, in the upper Great Lakes states, it's hard for us that live now to think of this. Double-crested cormorant in some states actually had threatened status at that time. Its population was really, really low. Now it's completely reversed itself. Lesser scaup, 6,000 plus, Caspian tern, 5,500, long-tailed ducks, 3,600. So again, I think this is spring data, and that already showing you that he was not capturing all those long-tailed ducks, because he actually started his beginning date for the spring season came after the bulk of those birds had already moved north. So that gray kind of thing that looks like a long cloud there, that's temperature data, right? And the dark line is numbers of individuals of long-tailed ducks. And you can see that this is actually autumn numbers, right? That the bulk of that number of long-tailed didn't show up until the water temperature and the air temperature got below X. I don't remember what the temperature was in consideration here, but you can see that cloud of temperature data trending downward towards the right. Here's the autumn, the opposite situation, right? No, this is spring, right? So you can see a really big push of birds, up to 20,000 birds on the 7th of March, right? And then again, after that temperature had changed just infinitesimally small range, those birds had already completely moved out of the Great Lakes. So here's red-breasted merganser numbers, autumn 2016. Again, in relation to the temperature, see that the bulk of those birds would show up when that temperature would be in, let's say, 38 to 60 degree Fahrenheit range. So that's when they would really begin to be abundant. So that's what I have for you this evening. I am welcome any of your questions. Yes, sir.
So I told him to assess the time transfer. Did you have to balance the low to herd the bird? That thing is not going to be super quiet.
So that was really interesting, depending on the species. Okay, so I was asked if using that Cessna Skymaster, if flying at that altitude above the water whether that, what you're asking is if that spooked the birds, correct?
You have to adjust the altitude.
No, we stayed at a constant altitude. And depending on the species and depending on where we were in relation to the shoreline, you could see very clearly that some birds were not spooked. They held their position, they didn't move at all. Other birds would dive away from the aircraft, and other species, the whole flock would lift off the water and sometimes fly maybe 20, 30 meters over the water. So I can remember flying at 100 meters above the water. We did not have birds near us very often, right? One exception to that was in the autumn, the bulk of the tundra swan migration moves from northwest to southeast across Great Lakes, right? And then in the spring, that big wintering mass of birds that's on Chesapeake Bay for the winter comes back across the Great Lakes. And we would be going north on one of our transects, and we would see this huge, massive V of tundra swans at about the same altitude that we were, but sometimes a mile or so away, right? It's just a stunningly beautiful sight against the blue water of the lake and the blue of the sky. These white swans, I'll never forget that as long as I live. Any other questions?
That we got like 30 below their temperature here in Illinois. Think about what 52, like
So if you went back through all the data, I haven't gone that far back, but you can find that over a period of a century, every 12 to 15 to 18 years, a really large proportion of the lake surface would be covered with ice. And there were, I've read accounts from the 1880s where it froze completely shore to shore, and they drove horses on sleighs out into the middle of the lake. It was in the Chicago Trib, you know, and now we haven't seen a lake shore to lake shore mass of ice in recent memory, but we have seen, again, every decade or decade and a half or so, we'll experience one of these polar vortices and really tremendous drop in temperature, and then that condition will make itself known. Other questions? Well, there are almost always gulls up there, right? A couple of gulls. And I'm actually thinking of writing a separate paper just about gulls. Because if you're a birder who birds Lake Michigan in the winter, one of the things you always look for is the big Arctic gulls that come down here in the winter. Glaucous gull, Iceland gull. For a while, there was a species which we don't credit as having any existence anymore, Thayer's gull. Let's not go there, right? But it was hard back when I started birding in the 60s and 70s, reasonably hard to find birds like Iceland gull and glaucous gull somewhere along the lakeshore, unless you really went hard at it. You had to travel a lot, you had to go to a lot of different harbors. Well, what I learned on doing these offshore flights, especially because of the existence of that floating ice out there, there are way more glaucous gulls and Iceland gulls than I ever realized, because they're way offshore in the lake. They're just resting on one of those ice floes. They're just lazy. They're lazy, taking it easy out there. And you know, they're Arctic birds, so that means nothing to them. But in the summer, you'd probably have a hard time going anywhere in the lake for more than an hour without seeing a gull of some species, and even in midsummer, right? Because there's always some summering birds that are floating around. there's a place, if you were to look at the bathymetry of the whole lake, there's a place in the southern half of the lake, approximately at the center point of the lake, called the mid-lake plateau, which is much more shallow than the surrounding waters. And for a while, they were actually considering that as a location to put some turbines, right? I think they've given up that idea, but that's a place you might find gulls on the 20th of July, right? What they're doing out there, they're probably finding some floating dead fish, you know, or other organisms to feed on, but there's almost always gulls. You know, if you live in a lake shore city anywhere around the Great Lakes, you'll see that we've all become maritime cities, because you can be 6, 7, 8 miles away from the lake shore, and if you watch the sky, I can predict to you that no 15-minute period will go by without you seeing a gull. So it's like living on the ocean.
We have a question from Team Audience. One person asked, how come Lake Superior was not included in the survey?
Well, Lake Superior really is a different cat, because it's so deep and it's so cold and oligotrophic. It's not a productive body of water. We find that it has diving ducks, gulls more, yes, but diving ducks few, and then only for relatively brief periods in spring and fall. And this picture that you get on Lake Erie or Lake Huron or Lake Michigan is totally different on Lake Superior. You just don't see flocks of diving ducks that stay there for like 2 months at a time. They just don't do it.
Another rarity, loons and gators.
So we saw a fair number of both red-hooded loons and common loons every year. We're not able to detect rare loon from the aircraft. We saw individual Jaegers once in a while. Occasionally we would see large shorebirds flying over the surface of the lake. You know, they're maybe this far above the water, but it was really almost impossible to detect what species they were from that distance. But you know, there are nocturnal movements of birds across the lake happening every spring and fall of all species of land birds as well as water birds. We don't see them because they're happening at night.
How do you ID like a ring-bill versus a herring when you're flying 100?
So if the bird is not too far away from the aircraft, you really look at the build of the bird, right? So ringbills and herring gulls, if they're within 50 meters, with a little practice, you get pretty good at telling the two of them apart, right? Now, once you throw in all the other age classes, like the first year, that makes it a little bit more complicated to do. And that's why, if you look at our data set, there are a lot of gull, species, right? Where we weren't able to tell what they were. Sure. Anybody else?
Off by talking about the inevitability of wind power on lakes. Why was it so important to you to do this?
Well, again, we reasoned that if we had data, we could have a seat at the table.
What does that mean?
So when an organization, let's say, submitted a proposal to the Corps of Engineers, right, to build a wind power installation, we reasoned if we could have a seat at the table, we could tell them where would be a good place not to build a wind farm offshore, right? Because there was actually a proposal to build one offshore from Two Rivers, Wisconsin. And that's, you know, right in that zone, right in that hot zone of all of those species being there. from fall into spring. So really poor location to choose. Now, they're looking at all kinds of different qualifying aspects of how the project might work, like the water depth, right? The average wind speed, how that would affect the engineering of a project like that, which wasn't anything we could speak to, but we could speak to the presence of the birds. Notice a few other hands there, yeah. Sure, so you don't use high power binoculars because as you've probably already experienced, once you get beyond about 10 power, the field of view is very limited, right? And you're scanning to look for individual birds or flocks. So I actually used a 7 power pair that had a really wide field, and that worked perfectly. And after we did this for a number of years, you could identify birds with the naked eye pretty easily, not always be able to tell them to species, but you could say, okay, there's a little flock of squawk there. There's a flock of longtails over there. Because you're not dealing with 100 species of birds. You're dealing with this very limited range of species. Most of them are extremely easy to identify if you get a good look. Anybody else?
Maybe the sense.
Can we ask questions from Zoom?
And it's not just a continuous water discovery.
Right.
So you're seeing like scattered flocks, individual.
That's what would happen. And sometimes you would go 20 minutes at a stretch and see nothing, right? So you had to keep yourself awake, keep alert, because things could change very quickly. And again, if we had a really large number of birds, we would often swing around and go over the flock more than once. No, but we've discussed this ad nauseum, as you might imagine. So if we were to attempt this project now, I would recommend doing it with drones, right? Because then you get a digital photograph, put the digital photograph on your computer monitor, and you can actually count individual birds and have a really accurate representation of the data, right? To be honest, when we had really large number of birds, we were doing some estimating. You can't count 10,000 birds in a flyby, right? So we got good at estimating, but it was still an estimate, right? And we say that, we explain that in our data, right? We don't try to pretend we've counted every individual bird, but if it's small flocks of birds, then you get very good at counting. It's kind of, again, if you've done Lake Michigan shoreline Christmas bird counts, you learn how to count birds in bunches, right? You subtend an area in the field of your scope, you count all of the individuals in that field, and then you just move the field of the scope over the entire flock, right? And the more you do this, better you get at it. It's practice.
Last question from our Zoom audience here. If there was a major push for wind turbines tomorrow, would the project be reinstated to update the data?
Really hard to say, but our data is all still there. It's all publicly available. And, we have partners in all these federal agencies that know about the existence of our data. So they could bring this to bear, right? Look, I can envision this. I can't predict to you that this is exactly what would happen. But let's say an entity that builds wind farms proposed a project, right? They would hire a consulting firm, a biological consulting firm, to gather data to begin to assess whether their location is likely to cause a problem or not, right? And they would end up using the data that we gathered. In the course of this project, I raised about $500,000 of grants, right? It's extremely expensive. Using the aircraft is extremely expensive, right? Paying for the fuel is expensive. Paying for the observers is expensive. Collating and analyzing the data is expensive. So every piece of the pie has a cost associated with it. And we ate up a lot of funds doing that for those number of years. Anybody else? Okay, thank you.